Join me as we unlock the stories of the past, turning the pages of history to discover the vibrant lives, struggles, and triumphs that have shaped our world. Picture yourself on a cobbled street in a damp little village, somewhere between the plague and the next holy day, where love letters are folded into psalms and glances are more dangerous than swords. The torches flicker, the air smells faintly of sheep and ale, and someone's about to propose with a goose. Sex, love, and romance in the Middle Ages weren't quite what you'd expect. For one, there wasn't much privacy. Doors were open, houses small, and you shared your mattress with your siblings, your dog, and occasionally a chicken. And while passion certainly bloomed, you had to be strategic about it. That look across the mead hall better hope her brother didn't see it. That smile from the merchant's daughter could be flirtation, or could be indigestion. You're about to fall asleep in a world where codpieces were considered the height of erotic fashion, where a man might win his beloved with a lute solo, or a particularly aggressive falcon, where courtly love meant writing poems to a lady you could never touch while sleeping with her maid on alternate Thursdays. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening somewhere across time zones, post your location and local time. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Wherever you are, I hope tonight brings you rest, comfort, and maybe a curious dream or two. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the great hall of a noble estate where torches line the stone walls and tapestries hide scandalous secrets stitched by bored hands. A troubadour croons something sweet and terribly off-key, but the lady of the house blushes anyway. That's courtship medieval style, half performance, half survival. Noble flirting is a formal sport. You don't just ask someone to dance, you quote Ovid badly. You compare her to a Rosa Pearl, maybe even a hunting hound if you're feeling bold. This is a time when wooing is strategic and reputation is the most fragile thing a person can wear. For noble women, a misstep in love isn't just gossip. It's a threat to her dowry, her marriage prospects, and her family's standing. And yet, love happens. Between awkward silences and escorted walks between dances that last a blink, and those torturous meals where a single touch of fingers under the table can ignite more fire than a bonfire in midsummer. Historians still argue whether most of these romantic rituals were sincere or simply performances forced by class, gender, and status. Was courtly love real love, or a convenient outlet for frustration in a world where marriages were arranged before puberty? Meanwhile, outside the manors and courts in the humbler settings of abbeys and farmhouses, a different kind of romance plays out. Young men might carve hearts into tree bark, or exchange trinkets, a comb, a spindle, a small mirror, tokens of desire. Peasant dances are less delicate, the jokes far bawdier, and flirting often happens under open skies and suspicious moonlight. But wherever it happened, attraction had rules. In some areas, you weren't allowed to marry someone from your own village, too risky for cousin confusion. In others, neighbors were encouraged to witness courting, just in case the bishop came asking. And if you were caught, well, depending on your social class, the punishment ranged from a firm scolding by the priest to a fine of 2 chickens, and a stern warning never to dance that close again. The church, of course, tried its best to supervise everything. A bishop might declare a love fast banning weddings during Lent or Advent. Monks preach sermons warning of dancing perfume and the fatal danger of soft music. According to one 13th century manual, even smiling too much at the opposite sex could lead to eternal damnation, though smiling at livestock was curiously not addressed. Among the upper classes, things could get even more theatrical. Ladies were expected to faint, dramatically drop lace handkerchiefs, and look longingly from balconies, though most of those balconies were drafty and plagued with pigeons. Knights pledged eternal loyalty with words penned in borrowed Latin, often stolen from books they couldn't read. One nobleman reportedly hired a minstrel to write songs comparing his lover's skin to a peeled almond. Another tried to win favor by jousting with the girl's cousin. He lost, both the match and the girl. And then there's the fashion. Codpieces bulged with exaggerated confidence, sometimes stuffed with rags or wool. Symbolism was everything: red for passion, green for youth, blue for fidelity. Lace sleeves hinted at virtue or seduction, depending on the lighting. A well-placed garter could ruin or rescue a man's reputation. Your bed, if you had one, wasn't just for sleep. It was a public sign of wealth and a tool for sealing alliances. In noble marriages, the bedding ceremony was often witnessed. That's right. People stood nearby to make sure the marriage was truly consummated. Sometimes they even cheered. Nothing says romance like an audience with goblets. But not everyone could afford poetry and performance. Many simply made do with songs sung softly at the village, well-shared cups of mead, and the occasional accidental brush of hands while grinding grain. There were no dating apps, just livestock fairs, saint festivals, and the deeply erotic moment when someone helped you carry your butter churn. And yet there's something oddly enduring about it all. Despite the layers of chaperones, the looming presence of the church, and the fact that nearly everything fun was banned on Sundays, people still fell in love. Sometimes foolishly, often inconveniently, but always with a certain stubborn hope that the heart might triumph over history's many rules. And while the codpieces have gone out of fashion mercifully, the art of awkward flirting lives on. You find yourself standing in a dusty armory, not of swords and shields, but of rumors and rusted myths. Among them lies one infamous object clanking in the shadows, the chastity belt. Perhaps you've seen the illustrations, iron contraptions studded with locks and ominous hinges allegedly worn by women while their crusading husbands were off gallivanting in the Holy Land. A medieval security system of sorts. But here's the twist: you probably wouldn't survive wearing one, and most likely neither did anyone else. The idea is dramatic girdles of iron and steel wrapped around one's private bits, locked tight by jealous lords or paranoid fathers. The problem: there's precious little evidence they were ever a real thing in medieval daily life. Historians still argue whether chastity belts were actually used or whether they were a Renaissance-era joke that got way, way out of hand. The earliest surviving examples often dated to the 16th century or later, and suspiciously theatrical. Of course, that hasn't stopped them from becoming icons. They show up in museums, comedy sketches, and historical dramas alike. But more than likely, they belonged in the same category as unicorn horns and plague masks, with mystical herbs part cautionary tale, part imaginative overreach. Still, the idea of locking up desire wasn't entirely fictional. Across Europe, social controls tried to accomplish metaphorically what the chastity belt did literally. Young women, especially noble ones, were watched closely. A lady-in-waiting wasn't just there to brush hair, she was a walking, whispering alarm system. Bedrooms had bells, windows were high, and in some cases ladies were sent to convents for safekeeping until marriage. Picture a girls' boarding school run by nuns with very little patience. That said, real efforts to control behavior were less metallic and more psychological. Guilt-shame sermons, confessions, and peer pressure did a much more efficient job than any iron underpants ever could. One bishop even described the armor of virtue as something no man could unfasten. Unless, of course, he brought wine. One odd mention of a supposed chastity belt comes from a travel account in the 1400s, where the author described a German merchant's wife wearing one. But oddly, the lock required frequent oiling, which rather ruins the drama. Another tale suggests French nobles had gold-plated belts for their wives, but the only source is a satirical poem involving cucumbers. Yes, cucumbers, you can draw your own conclusions. Still, the fear behind the belt was real. The anxiety that a woman might act on her own desires or worse, produce a child not fathered by her lawful husband. Lineage was currency, especially among the upper classes, and any threat to a bloodline, real or imagined, was met with extreme caution. Among the common folk, things were more relaxed. There were no belts, but there were boundaries. A girl caught with a boy behind the haystack could be forced to marry him, or else pay a fine and suffer a bit of local gossip. That gossip, by the way, was no small matter. In some towns, women accused of being too familiar could be made to carry a stone through the streets, or sit on the cucking stool by the river, a wooden chair designed to make you very wet and very humiliated. The idea of locking things away wasn't limited to the female body. Male behavior, too, was constantly policed, especially in urban centers. Laws prohibited lewd assemblies, banned musicians from playing certain romantic songs, and even required candles to be extinguished at a particular hour. Paris, for example, had a curfew bell, known affectionately as the lover's enemy. Yet despite all this, human creativity flourished. Lovers found ways around the rules. Messages were hidden in books or sent via trusted servants. One medieval flirtation technique involved passing apples back and forth, apples that had been secretly touched to one's chest or lips. A bite of fruit could carry more longing than 100 verses. And while you might not find chastity belts in real use, you will find belts of another kind, those worn by flagellants. These were people so frightened by temptation they whipped themselves in public sometimes with metal-tipped lashes. Imagine someone trying to impress their crush with a fresh, self-inflicted wound. Different times, different courtship techniques. Let's not forget the jokes, though. Medieval literature is full of satire about obsessive husbands, suspicious wives, and inventors creating ridiculous contraptions to protect their honor. One story tells of a man who designs a magical lock that screams if touched. Another includes a talking dog that sniffs out infidelity. We're not sure what the dog's union demanded, but it probably included dental. Quirky artifacts crop up in private collections, some with ornate keyholes, others with floral engravings. But historians today agree that most are theatrical curiosities, or later creations meant to titillate or amuse rather than enforce actual fidelity. Still, the legacy of the chastity belt lingers in popular imagination. It's a symbol of fear control and the eternal attempt to outwit desire with design. But as history keeps reminding us, desire usually finds a way over the wall under the skirt or through a poem tied to a pigeon's leg. And somewhere behind a glass museum case, a dusty iron belt lies silent. A relic of imagination, misunderstood morality, and perhaps the most uncomfortable fashion statement ever conceived. You wake to the tolling of bells echoing across the stone courtyards of a medieval town, each chime reminding you that someone somewhere is likely sinning, or at least thinking about it. Because in the medieval world, sex wasn't just a private act. It was a theological minefield. And the church, well, it had opinions. Strong, specific, occasionally bizarre opinions. By the 12th century, Catholic doctrine had built a meticulous calendar of do's and absolutely don'ts. It's Wednesday, no intimacy. Friday, nope. Christ died that day. Sunday, obviously not. Advent and Lent. Are you trying to be excommunicated, add it all up, and you're left with a disturbingly small window of time where marital relations were technically permitted? probably around the second Tuesday of every third month, assuming there wasn't a saint's feast or a thunderstorm. And yes, lightning was a real concern. Some medieval theologians believed it was a divine warning against immoral acts. Others just thought it was bad timing. Either way, if a storm rolled in during your designated night, well, better luck next quarter. Clerics often advise couples to abstain from sex for spiritual reasons, particularly before receiving communion during mourning, or if one had recently sneezed too enthusiastically during Mass. Okay, maybe not the sneezing, but you get the idea. The church's list of restrictions was extensive and they weren't shy about enforcing them. Mainstream medieval theologians like Thomas Aquinas believed that sex even within marriage was only justified if it fulfilled the purpose of procreation. Anything else, he suggested, leaned suspiciously toward sin. Fun forbidden, passion dangerous, missionary acceptable, anything more creative. A direct ticket to confession and possibly a brief stay in purgatory with the other experimental thinkers. Historians still argue whether these rules were widely followed or simply preached with gusto from the pulpit, while the congregation nodded politely and then ignored them entirely. After all, human nature doesn't shift just because someone in robes scowls at you from a wooden pulpit. In practice, local priests did their best to regulate behavior. In confessions, people might be asked how often they had sex in what position, and whether they had enjoyed it. Yes, really. One medieval confession guide warned against excessive fondness, which included kissing too long or sighing too much afterward, because God apparently kept notes on emotional vulnerability. And yet the church wasn't just a party pooper. It also shaped how people thought about love and intimacy on a deeper level. Religious writings often celebrated marital affection, as long as it was modest, disciplined, and definitely not on a feast day. One 13th century sermon even praised a couple who only made love in silence under separate sheets and with a crucifix nearby to observe. Cozy. But let's be honest, for all the rules and warnings, people found ways to interpret doctrine flexibly. Some married couples practiced what we might call devotional loopholes, praying before and after the act, fasting beforehand, or agreeing to only do it while thinking of their future children. Kind of like saying grace before dessert, but with slightly more candles and a lingering sense of guilt. One curious quirk of medieval theology was the ranking of sins. Murder, awful. Theft, bad. But sins of the flesh, those got special attention. Why? Because they were so tempting. Lust was seen as particularly insidious, something that could corrupt even the most devout. Priests described it as a slippery slope, a gateway vice, a kind of mental plague that began with a glance and ended in eternal damnation. Or worse, pregnancy. And yes, if a priest caught wind of an unmarried couple fooling around, consequences varied. In some places, they'd be forced into a hand-fasting, a temporary marriage of sorts, sealed by holding hands before witnesses. In others, they'd pay fines, do penance, or walk through the village square wearing their underclothes inside out, which in February was probably enough to make anyone reconsider their dating strategy. The concept of sin was everywhere. There were penitential books, thick volumes, listing how many prayers or fast were needed to atone for various deeds. Had sex on a holy day, 30 days of bread and water. Used contraception, double that. Engaged in unnatural acts. Let's just say you'd need a lifetime supply of rosary beads and very sturdy knees. And yet, amid all this restriction, certain saints and theologians offered surprisingly tender reflections on marital intimacy. Saint Isidore, for instance, described the union of man and wife as a sacred bond, something that mirrored divine love when approached with respect. Even Augustine, famous for his guilt-soaked reflections, admitted that marital affection could be ordered toward the good. Of course, he also described his early years as a time of unrestrained fire, so perhaps he was speaking from experience. Outside the church, folk beliefs complicated matters further. In some regions, people believed that intimacy during certain moon phases could lead to cursed children. Others thought that abstaining before battle made soldiers stronger. And then there were the local herbalists who sold potions to cleanse the soul after a night of questionable decisions, usually made of nettles vinegar and regret. It wasn't all gloom, though. Court records and love letters show that many couples carved out spaces of affection, laughter, and tenderness in their relationships, even under the watchful eye of religious doctrine. One woman wrote to her husband that she missed his feet beside hers on the cold nights, while another declared that his absence made her forget the sound of her own breath. Medieval romance was real. Awkward, coded, repressed, but undeniably real. And if you're wondering whether people ever broke the rules just for fun, absolutely. There are accounts of tavern songs mocking pious husbands, wandering monks with suspiciously rosy cheeks, and entire festivals like the Feast of Fools, where the normal rules were turned upside down and laughter replaced confession, at least until Monday, because even when the church said no on Wednesdays, Fridays, Sundays, saints' days, and feast days' desire never quite took a holiday. You wake up to the rhythmic thud of boots on packed dirt smoke, curling from crooked chimneys and the sound of goats bickering over breakfast. Welcome to the village where life is muddy loud and blessedly free of courtly poetry. Here, love has no lute solos. It's built on eye contact across cabbage patches, shared chores, and the occasional lascivious wink over a wheelbarrow. In medieval peasant life, sex wasn't secretive, it was practical. Families lived in one-room cottages with earthen floors, thatched roofs, and little to no privacy. The children, grandparents, chickens, and fleas all shared one space. If you wanted privacy, your best option was to wait for everyone else to fall asleep, or go out to the barn, which is how haystacks became history's most rustic honeymoon suite. It wasn't romantic in the courtly sense, but it had its own rough charm. Love grew through routine. You milked together, you mended together, you danced at village feasts, and maybe you held hands in the dark behind the grain store. You didn't need roses. You needed someone who could shear sheep and had a full set of teeth. Marriage for peasants was often semi-arranged, but rooted in local connection. Your future spouse lived within a 5-mile radius, probably knew your mother, and definitely knew how many chickens your family owned. Dowries were modest, maybe a blanket, a cow, or a particularly sturdy stool. But affection wasn't absent. There are surviving love tokens like carved spoons, embroidered handkerchiefs, or even a nice rock. Yes, love rocks were a thing. And here's a delightful twist: while noble marriages were contracts of land and lineage, peasant unions allowed for something more spontaneous: hand fasting. It was a kind of trial marriage where two people agreed to live together for a year and a day. If it worked, they stayed. If not, no paperwork, no annulment, just a firm handshake and a return to separate haystacks. Historians still argue whether hand fasting was legally binding or just an accepted custom, but records show it was common enough to cause headaches for the local clergy. One frustrated priest in Lincolnshire complained that the young take to each other as badgers to burrows without sacrament or supervision. Badgers aside, the system had its merits. Of course, not all relationships were so tidy. Premarital sex was common, and in many places, couples who were already expecting were encouraged or forced to marry quickly. Shotgun weddings weren't just a modern invention. In some towns, if a baby was born too soon after the wedding, the couple had to pay a fine or confess publicly. Sometimes they were forgiven with a wink, sometimes with stocks. And speaking of stocks, Shame punishments were the medieval answer to community gossip. If caught being indecent, a couple might be paraded through town with ribbons tied to their arms, or worse, made to wear antlers and bray like donkeys. Subtlety was not the village's strong suit. Yet, despite these risks, love flourished. Festival days were particularly amorous. May Day celebrations, for example, were known for their playful license. Boys and girls would pair off to gather flowers, an innocent-sounding tradition that frequently ended in not-so-innocent ways beneath the blooming branches. Local priests often looked the other way, provided no one danced too vigorously around the maypole. And there were games. Oh, the games. Flirtatious competitions involving kissing under cloaks, tug-of-war with undergarments, and catch the goose, which was either a game or a very confusing proposal. Folk culture didn't see sex as evil. It was part of life like brewing ale or losing your shoe in the mud. And people laughed about it more than we give them credit for. Medical ideas of the time also encouraged openness. Popular belief held that a woman needed to enjoy sex in order to conceive. Yes, enjoy it. Midwives were taught to ask expectant mothers about their joy of the act, and some herbalists even sold teas to help bring the good cheer of Venus. Say what you will about medieval medicine, it tried. Another quirky belief that children resembled whichever parent was thinking harder during conception. If the mother was in a good mood, the baby might be beautiful. If the father was distracted by taxes, well, better luck next time. Some texts even advised couples to stare at paintings of handsome people during the act, just to tilt the odds. You'll also find references to bundling a sleepover tradition, where two courting people lay in bed together with a board between them, or fully clothed, tied up in a blanket like a medieval burrito. The idea was to promote intimacy without actual intimacy. Predictably, it worked about as well as you'd expect. One Welsh village reportedly banned bundling after 7 wedding banns were read in 1 week, all involving suspiciously plump brides. And for all this rustic charm, there was no shortage of superstition. Some couples hung rowan branches over the door to promote fertility. Others avoided onions before intimacy, believing they might sour the seed. You wouldn't want sour seed, not in any context. Even the beds themselves had traditions. It was common for newlyweds to be put to bed by the entire family. Not figuratively, literally. They were escorted, watched, sometimes blessed, and occasionally tucked in by laughing cousins. Talk about pressure. The idea was to bind the community to the couple's union, though modern couples might prefer a little more solo time. But perhaps the most touching aspect of peasant love was its endurance. With little money, no poetry, and lives full of physical labor, these relationships relied on shared resilience. You needed someone who could fix a fence berth, a calf, and still make you laugh while your roof leaked for the 5th straight day. It wasn't romantic in the ways we usually imagine. There were no gilded carriages or serenades, but there was a warmth raw, messy, and deeply human. Because in a world without privacy, without luxury, and without much control over life's chaos, love was both rebellion and refuge. Even if you had to share your bed with the family goat, you're stepping carefully now up the worn marble steps of a noble household, through silk-draped archways into a world where flirtation hides behind protocol and scandal lounges just behind the velvet curtain. This isn't village love anymore. This is noble seduction where the stakes are high. The gossip flows like wine and reputations can shatter with a misplaced glance. Noble romance in the medieval period wasn't necessarily about love. In fact, love was often considered a liability. Marriages were transactions, alliances of land, title, and influence. But human nature doesn't always wait for papal permission. So behind every arranged union stood a shadow of longing, a chambermaid with knowing eyes, a falconer who lingered too long, a knight who swore fealty a little too passionately. Among the nobility, seduction was both sport and scandal. Courtly love was the official game, highly stylized, deeply impractical, and often hilariously unrequited. A knight would pledge himself to a lady he could never marry. She might be his lord's wife, or a duchess far above his station. Either way, he wrote poems, he dueled, he sighed, he bled dramatically, often while gazing at her handkerchief. Court records tell us of real affairs, too, some messy, others carefully curated. One countess in Normandy reportedly kept a secret lover disguised as her falconer for nearly a decade. They communicated through coded embroidery on saddlecloths. Subtle, yes. Secure, not especially. And then there's the infamous love triangle of Eleanor of Aquitaine, her husband Henry II, and their volatile sons, particularly Richard the Lionheart, whose own relationships historians still whisper about. Eleanor herself was no stranger to scandal. Before Henry, she was married to the King of France. After an annulment due to consanguinity, though more likely mutual boredom, she married Henry and became Queen of England. She also may have written bawdy poetry, a queen of multiple crowns and possibly a limerick or two. Historians still argue whether the tradition of courtly love encouraged actual affairs or merely channeled frustration into florid verse. Was it an outlet, a cover story, a social script for managing the inevitable? Whatever it was, it provided just enough room for desire to breathe so long as no one got caught. Getting caught, however, could be disastrous. For men, consequences varied. A nobleman exposed in an affair might pay a fine, perform penance, or at worst, be sent off to war for honor. For women, the stakes were much higher. An adulterous noblewoman risked confinement, annulment, exile, or even execution, depending on the mood of her husband and the proximity of the Inquisition. Take the case of Isabella of Angoulême, wife of King John of England. After John's death, she returned to France and married a much younger nobleman without the required permission. Her scandal set tongues wagging, and though she escaped punishment, it tainted her legacy. Her daughter Joan would go on to become the Queen of Scotland, possibly carrying her mother's taste for bold decisions. But the upper classes weren't all whispers and hidden letters. Some were gloriously open about their desires. Medieval Italy, in particular, was home to noble households where poetry, music, and flirtation were integral parts of evening entertainment. One Florentine salon kept a book of glances recording which guest had stared at, which other guessed the longest. It was quite literally a spreadsheet of longing. And then there were annulments, the official medieval version of "it's not me, it's God." Nobles seeking release from unhappy marriages often claimed spiritual incompatibility, consanguinity again, or in one creative case, excessive prayerfulness. That is, the spouse was so devout they could not bear to share a bed. How holy of them! Some of the most scandalous tales come from the court of Burgundy, where Duke Philip the Good kept a book listing over 50 named mistresses. His court wasn't just permissive, it was practically a medieval soap opera with love triangles, secret baptisms, and a rumored masquerade involving goat masks. Don't ask. We won't explain. You wouldn't sleep. Of course, seduction didn't always require nobility. Even knights and minor lords played dangerous games. One record from 13th century England describes a squire who wooed a baron's daughter by serenading her from beneath her window for 14 nights. She eventually responded by tossing him a single shoe. Scholars still debate whether this meant "yes, go away" or "I dropped this." Let's not forget the letters. Oh, the letters. Surviving correspondences between noble lovers are stuffed with euphemisms. Roses, stars, aching hearts, and occasionally worryingly specific metaphors involving falcons and the moon. One French knight compared his lover's smile to the first thaw of spring upon a sword blade. Romantic. A bit sharp, but points for creativity. The codpieces we mentioned earlier also deserve another glance, though not too close. By the late medieval period, men of court displayed their status with increasingly absurd designs. Some were padded, some were bejeweled. One even had a drawbridge mechanism. Subtlety was not the goal. As for the women, fashion itself became a language of flirtation. Sleeves were detachable, perfect for gifting. Necklines fluctuated with scandal. Hair was often braided with ribbons from a suitor, then hidden under veils if the affair needed to stay hush-hush. And perfumes. Carefully mixed from herbs, rose oil, and occasionally deer glands. Love stank quite literally. Noble seduction was a high-wire act, thrilling, perilous, and rarely private. Castles had too many servants. Banquets had too much wine. And troubadours, well, they repeated everything. They were medieval Instagram poetic, slightly filtered and prone to oversharing. Still beneath the theater, there were genuine connections. Between all the arranged marriages and the political unions, some couples found ways to fall in love. To meet at night in gardens, to write each other sonnets, to leave behind tokens that somehow made it through centuries, ribbons, notes, a lock of hair. And perhaps that's the most human part of it all. For every affair that ended in disgrace, another ended in memory, woven into songs, scribbled into margins, or tucked inside a family Bible where generations later, someone might find it and wonder. You now tiptoe through echoing stone corridors where the scent of beeswax and incense lingers beneath high arched ceilings. Welcome to the monastery. Or maybe it's a convent. Either way, your footsteps are muffled by centuries of silence, whispered prayers, and the occasional rustle of parchment, not entirely related to scripture. Because here among the pious and the celibate flourished some of the most curious, complicated relationships in medieval history. Contrary to popular belief, monks and nuns were not immune to desire. Vows of chastity weren't magic shields, they were commitments. And commitments are hard. Especially when your only social outlet is Brother Thomas, who smells faintly of sheep and candle smoke, or Sister Beatrice with eyes like stained glass. In fact, monastic life was filled with intimacy, structured, spiritual, and sometimes emotional to the point of scandal. Spiritual friendships were common and even encouraged. These were deep, loving bonds between individuals that might look platonic on the outside, but inside... Well, scholars still debate whether they crossed the line. Some letters survive tender aching, occasionally drenched in metaphor. A 12th century monk once wrote to another, "I long for the sweetness of your embrace as the deer pants for the water brook." Another more boldly said, "My soul clings to you more than to Christ." That one raised eyebrows even back then. Historians still argue whether these friendships were emotionally intense but non-physical, or whether they occasionally wandered into more corporeal territory. It's likely that both happened. Some monastic pairs simply found solace in shared prayer. Others, well, let's just say the confessional line was longer on certain feast days. Nunneries, too, were hotbeds of complex emotion. Life inside was filled with rituals, routines, and relationships. Senior nuns mentored novices. Confessions were frequent. Letters were passed under doorways. And sometimes very real love stories unfolded, complete with heartbreak, jealousy, and coded embroidery. One of the most famous examples comes from the story of Eloise and Abelard, though technically Heloise became a nun after things went sideways. She was brilliant, outspoken, and in love with her tutor, Peter Abelard. They had a passionate affair, a secret child, and a hasty marriage. When her uncle found out he had Abelard castrated, yes, castrated, you probably wouldn't survive medieval romance. After the incident, they both took religious vows. Their love letters, sent over decades, are among the most poignant medieval writings we have. She writes of her grief, her desire, and her confusion. He replies with cold philosophy. It's messy, tragic, and achingly human. Within monasteries, relationships also sparked among men. The rule of St. Benedict didn't have explicit language for queer desire, but that didn't mean it didn't exist. In fact, multiple church councils issued warnings against sinful familiarity between monks. They didn't tend to issue warnings about things that never happened. One particularly stern abbot banned all two-person prayer sessions after dark. Another required monks to sleep in their robes, belted tightly, of course. Just in case devotion led to deviation, even punishment tells part of the story. Records show monks being relocated, demoted, or ordered into solitary contemplation for reasons described only as improprieties. It's the medieval equivalent of HR quietly moving your desk to the far end of the scriptorium. And then there's the nun who reportedly faked menstruation using red berries to avoid a regular medical check. Why she was hiding a pregnancy? How did she explain it? She claimed it was a miracle. Spoiler, the abbess disagreed. Some convents had looser supervision. Wealthy nunneries sometimes functioned more like noble retreats than strict religious centers. There are letters from visitors describing gardens filled with music, dancing, and flirtation. Hardly the ascetic environment you'd expect. One Italian nunnery in the 14th century reportedly had a wine cellar larger than its chapel. Make of that what you will. Fascinatingly, some female saints describe their connection to Christ in language that is startlingly intimate. Saint Catherine of Siena claimed she was spiritually married to Jesus, complete with an invisible wedding ring made from his foreskin. You heard that correctly. Mysticism in the Middle Ages was bold, surreal, and not especially PG. Another nun, Saint Lutgard, described Jesus appearing in her cell and embracing her heart to heart. These visions were written in ecstatic, sometimes erotic language. Historians are still unsure whether this was a reflection of genuine spiritual rapture or a subversive way to express emotional longing in a repressive system. Possibly both. Mysticism gave medieval women a unique kind of voice. In an age when female agency was tightly controlled, some nuns used their visions to command respect, influence politics, and even critique male clergy. It's easier to get away with bold opinions when you're supposedly quoting Jesus. Of course, not all monastic mischief was emotional. Some records reveal physical affairs often between monks and local women or nuns and visiting clerics. In one instance, a nun gave birth and tried to dispose of the baby in a convent bread oven. When discovered, she claimed it was a gift from the angel Gabriel. Bold defense. Didn't work. Punishments for these transgressions varied. Some were defrocked, others confined. But sometimes if the offending party had connections or was especially popular, things were quietly swept under the altar rug. Monasteries were communities complete with hierarchies, politics, and the occasional whispered cover-up. You might think of these cloisters as sealed off from the world, but they were more like fish bowls. Villagers visited, nobles donated, bishops inspected, and troubadours, ever the sneaky messengers, often delivered more than just spiritual news. One ballad even hints at a romance between a monk and a noblewoman, disguised as a fellow monk. There's no record of how that story ended, but we hope with matching tonsures. For all the vows and veils, monastic life was fully human. It held longing and loneliness, friendships that hovered on the edge of something more, and desires that refused to be contained by stone walls or liturgical schedules. Behind every quiet chapel and darkened cell, there were stories, not all of them recorded in the Book of Hours. You're now inside a small, smoky apothecary, shelves lined with bottles, bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, and a cat curled on a pile of parchment that may or may not contain medical advice. Welcome to the medieval pharmacist's corner, where the pursuit of love, or more precisely the avoidance of its consequences, took the form of boiling plants, whispered prayers, and more parsley than any human could ever reasonably need. Because when it came to birth control in the Middle Ages, there was no pill, no latex, and certainly no convenient aisle in the village market. But that didn't mean people weren't trying. Quite the opposite. If you were sexually active and didn't fancy the idea of a surprise child or a scandalous visit from your confessor, you turned to a patchwork collection of herbal remedies, magical rituals, and questionable advice passed down from women who knew far more than the local priest wanted them to. Parsley, for example, was not just a garnish. It was boiled, steeped, and sometimes inserted. Pennyroyal, rue, and mugwort were also favorites. Midwives knew which combinations moved the womb and which ones might harden the seed. Yes, those were real phrases, and they often came with grim warnings: doze it wrong and you could fall asleep forever. Historians still argue whether medieval women's knowledge of contraceptive herbs was widespread or localized to a few learned practitioners. The problem is most of this knowledge was never written down, not because it didn't exist, but because it wasn't considered scholarly enough for monks to transcribe. And women barred from universities and scriptoriums passed these secrets through hands, not books. That said, a few brave souls did record them. The Trotula, a 12th century collection of women's medicine, attributed to a female physician from Salerno, includes recipes for preventing conception. One involves soaking wool in a mixture of olive oil and cedar sap, then placing it well in the region of concern. Another recommends fumigating the womb with smoke from burned herbs. Don't try that at home. And then there were the amulets, small charms carried in pouches or sewn into clothing. Some bore inscriptions, others contained dried animal parts. One popular talisman was a dried weasel's foot believed to ward off pregnancy. Another featured a snippet of Psalm 51 written in reverse. If you're thinking that sounds more like a wizard's prop than medical advice, you're not wrong. But in a world where spiritual and physical health were entwined, it made perfect sense. There were also behavioral methods. A few medieval writers, often monks who had never seen a woman naked, suggested cooling the passions with cold baths or tight belts. One even advised avoiding lustful foods like garlic, onions, and wine. Imagine trying to maintain a relationship on boiled oats in silence. Passionate numbered digestible, maybe. Some advice was deeply unhelpful. One 13th century guide advised women to jump backwards 7 times immediately after intercourse to dislodge the seed. Another recommended holding your breath and sneezing forcefully. Surprisingly, this didn't revolutionize reproductive health, and yet medieval people were far from clueless. Many women knew how to read their own bodies, tracking cycles through lunar calendars, monitoring signs with the help of older female relatives. They knew when they were most fertile. They also knew when not to trust churchmen offering herbal advice. Especially Brother Matthew, who swore that eating boiled eels closed the womb. No, Matthew, just no. Abortifacients herbs meant to induce miscarriage were also part of the picture. Rue, tansy, and savin were potent and dangerous. Administered incorrectly, they could kill. But for desperate women with no legal or safe alternative, these options were sometimes the only ones available. It's a sobering truth often buried beneath layers of romanticized history. Despite the church's disapproval, contraceptive efforts persisted. Most clergy turned a blind eye. Some condemned it from the pulpit. A few even tried to ban the sale of love herbs. But enforcement was tricky, especially when the midwife, the herbalist, and the apothecary were also the only people in town who could help you survive childbirth. Oddly, men had their own birth control tricks, though fewer. One involved wearing amulets made of lead, yes, actual lead. Another claimed that tying a ribbon around your left thigh would redirect the urge. No evidence suggests this worked, or helped, or was comfortable. And then there was coitus interruptus, known politely in some texts as the withdrawal before the moment of spoil. Not exactly poetry, but it did show that medieval couples were experimenting with non-herbal methods too. There's even evidence in canon law that withdrawal was discussed, debated, and reluctantly tolerated, though only if the goal was to avoid excessive multiplication. What's curious is how medieval thinkers treated the morality of birth control. For some, avoiding children was a rejection of God's plan. For others, especially those living in poverty or danger, it was survival. Theologians like Augustine condemned contraception as sinful. But midwives knew better. They saw the toll of too many births, too closely spaced. They saw women worn thin by expectation and fear. They did what they could quietly, bravely, with a bundle of dried rue and the moon overhead. Even today, traces of this secret knowledge survive. Some folk remedies still used in rural Europe echo medieval recipes. And tucked in the corners of old herbals are symbols and codes that hint at the hands who scribbled them, not monks but mothers. So as you sit in the apothecary sipping a bitter infusion that promises to steady the womb and sweeten the humors, remember this: long before modern science, there were women who knew. They knew how to balance risk and hope, how to navigate judgment, how to care for each other with leaves, whispers, and stubborn grace. And they did it in the flickering light under the weight of silence while the rest of the world pretended they didn't exist. You stand now at the threshold of a wedding chamber, a room trimmed with garlands, half lit by flickering candles, and already filled with the murmurs of curious relatives loitering just outside the door. Because in the Middle Ages, a wedding didn't end at the altar, it ended with bedsheet spectators and the occasional scandal involving a missing sock. Marriage was more than a celebration. It was a contract, a social performance, and often a legal headache. And the moment that truly sealed the deal, the consummation. No pressure. Medieval law across much of Europe required not just a spoken vow, but physical proof that the couple had, shall we say, finalized the arrangement. Marital congress, as one legal scholar euphemistically put it, was necessary to make a marriage valid and binding. Without it, you could argue for annulment even years later. Which brings us to the bedsheets. In many regions, especially among the nobility, the consummation of marriage was witnessed either directly or ceremonially. And before you panic, no, this didn't always mean someone stood at the foot of the bed taking notes. Often it was more symbolic. The bride and groom were tucked into bed, fully dressed. The guests toasted, and everyone politely filed out. The real business happened afterward. Hopefully, but in some places it was more enthusiastic. Certain traditions called for relatives to remain just outside the room, cheering, singing, or deeply awkward offering advice. A few even knocked on the walls to encourage progress. In England, the phrase "watching the bed" became shorthand for this odd combination of celebration and supervision. And the next morning, the proof. Sheets bearing signs of consummation, either actual stains or suggestive wrinkling, were sometimes presented to family members or officials. In noble houses, these could be inspected by matrons, midwives, or on very unlucky occasions, a scribe with poor career choices. Yes, medieval HR was weird. The display of bedsheets wasn't just symbolic, it had legal ramifications. In disputes over inheritance or accusations of annulment, these sheets could be summoned as evidence. One French case from the 14th century involved a nobleman who claimed his wife had fainted with revulsion before consummation, and therefore the marriage wasn't valid. Her family produced a very wrinkled sheet. The case was dismissed. Historians still argue whether such displays were common practice or rare theatrical gestures reserved for elite households. Rural families likely skipped the bedsheet drama in favor of simpler customs like a morning gift, a piece of jewelry, or property given by the husband after the first night meant to signal satisfaction and sincerity. And let's not forget the role of the dowry. In many parts of Europe, the bride's family provided money, goods, or land to the groom, essentially a financial handshake to support the new household. But if the marriage wasn't consummated, that dowry could be reclaimed. Hence the sudden interest in crumpled linens and awkward testimony. Sometimes, if a marriage was under dispute, church courts got involved. Witnesses were summoned, including servants who had seen the couple emerge from the chamber or heard suspicious noises. One record notes a housemaid testifying, "I heard a rustling and then silence followed by snoring." Not exactly courtroom gold, but enough to sway the verdict. For the poor, the stakes were different. No dowries, no inheritance disputes. But consummation still mattered. In some towns, if an unmarried couple was known to be bedded, they were presumed married, which meant a whole lot of shotgun ceremonies and sheepish walks down the aisle. Wedding customs varied wildly by region. In Scandinavia, couples shared ale from a communal horn. In Germany, the bride and groom jumped over a broom. In parts of France, friends banged pots outside the newlywed's house, all night, a tradition known as charivary, equal parts celebration and sleep deprivation. And if the marriage wasn't working, tough luck. Divorce wasn't really an option in most of medieval Europe. Annulment was possible, but required serious legal gymnastics. You could claim consanguinity, being too closely related to impotence or lack of consent, but proving any of those meant witnesses' investigations and often public humiliation. One noblewoman seeking annulment accused her husband of being as cold as a winter river. His defense, he blamed her overbearing scent of garlic. The court ordered a medical exam. The details were not recorded. We are grateful. Sometimes marriages were declared invalid because of pre-contract secret betrothals made to someone else before the current union. These could unravel the whole arrangement. Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing hinges on such a tangle. Apparently, even fictional weddings weren't safe. Despite all the scrutiny, many couples did find affection after marriage. Arranged or not, proximity bred familiarity. Love letters exist from husbands to wives, thanking them for kindness during illness or sending gifts of dried fruit from distant markets. One knight wrote to his wife, "I pray for your smile more than for my sword." Sweet. Slightly impractical, but sweet. Sexual advice also made its way into marital literature. The Speculum Maius, a 13th century encyclopedia, warned against excessive passion, especially during unseasonable hours. Midnight apparently was frowned upon. And the De Secretis Mulierum, or Secrets of Women, offered advice like, "Let not the man overexert himself, for it doth offend the humors," which is medieval for "don't try to impress her, just be presentable and polite." There were even beliefs about auspicious days to consummate. Tuesday was good. Saturday, avoid. The stars had opinions, and some astrologers were happy to share them for a fee, of course. For widows and widowers, remarriage was common. The church preferred lifelong unions but didn't object to remarriage if the spouse had died, so long as you waited an appropriate amount of time. One Italian merchant remarried so fast that his neighbors nicknamed him Il Vedovo Allegro, the cheerful widower. Cheerful. And through it all, the bedsheets remained sometimes folded in trunks, sometimes paraded in courts, and sometimes burned quietly in back gardens when things didn't go quite as planned. Because in medieval life, marriage was never just a matter of love. It was law, it was money, it was social theater. But beneath all that, in quiet moments between the noise and the spectacle, it could also be two people simply trying to find warmth in the same drafty room. You wake this time to the sound of heavy boots and muttered Latin. It's not a church service, it's a trial. Not for theft or heresy or punching the town reeve. No, you're here for something much more personal: virginity. And not your own, thank goodness, but someone's. Because in medieval Europe, whether a woman was a virgin wasn't just a private matter. It was a legal, spiritual, and sometimes absurdly theatrical affair. Let's start with the basics. Why did it matter so much? In short, inheritance, honor, and control. A woman's virginity, especially among the nobility, was considered a guarantee of paternity. If she was untouched, any future child she bore would be presumed her husband's. And if she wasn't, well, chaos, scandal, possibly excommunication, and definitely some uncomfortable silences at dinner. This obsession gave rise to virginity tests. These were real, often performed by midwives and sometimes even ordered by courts or ecclesiastical authorities. They were meant to verify whether a bride was, as they put it, intact. The tests ranged from the medical to the mystical to the just plain bizarre. One method involved checking for the presence of a hymen, though medieval understanding of female anatomy was rudimentary at best. Another test suggested examining whether the girl winced upon insertion of two fingers. Let's just take a moment to sigh deeply and collectively agree that's not science. Historians still argue how common these tests actually were. Records suggest they were more frequent in cases of annulment scandal or suspicion, not part of your everyday marriage ceremony. But they certainly left a psychological shadow across medieval culture. Sometimes tests were entirely symbolic. In one 14th century case, a bride accused of not being a virgin was made to walk barefoot through the town holding a white candle. If the flame flickered, it meant she was innocent. The logic: purity expire, steady flame. Wind spiders promiscuity. The medieval weather forecast was apparently full of judgment. In another case, a noblewoman was examined by 3 matrons and 1 physician. Their conclusion: the threshold has been crossed, but the door is not broken. To this day, no one knows what that means, probably not even them. And it didn't stop at women. Men, too, could be subjected to scrutiny, especially if a bride claimed her husband was impotent. That was grounds for annulment. Cue the trial by virility. Yes, really. The accused man would be brought before a panel sometimes, including clergy, sometimes midwives, and asked to perform a demonstration of his functional state. This might involve producing an erection with or without assistance. In one infamous French case, the court summoned the man's wife to the chamber, and then waited very awkwardly in the next room. The husband failed. The marriage was annulled. One 15th century record tells of a young groom who, facing such a test, fled the village entirely. When caught, he claimed a local witch had cursed him. The court ordered a priest, 2 apothecaries, and a rooster to participate in a purification ritual. Again, we do not know the rooster's role. We only know he did not volunteer. If all of this sounds horrifying, it was. but it was also sometimes theatrical. In one tavern ballad from the late 1300s, a woman brags that she tricked a virginity test by using a pig's bladder, some goose fat, and a timely fainting spell. Folk heroes weren't always warriors, sometimes they were just clever brides. The obsession with virginity wasn't limited to trials, it was baked into art literature and legend. Think of the unicorn, the animal that, according to medieval bestiaries, could only be tamed by a virgin maiden. Artists often painted Mary with a unicorn resting in her lap, while poets waxed poetic about the sealed gate of virtue. Subtle not remotely. There was also the virginity belt, not to be confused with the chastity belt. This was metaphorical, a poetic idea of purity, reinforced by sermons and morality plays. One popular allegory involved a knight who could only pass through the castle of grace if he wore the sash of restraint. The performance ended with him getting hit on the head by a nun with a tambourine. Very uplifting. Let's not forget relics. Several churches claimed to possess the milk of the Virgin Mary, while others bragged about the tears of sainted virgins. These relics were prized because they represented untouched holiness, though whether they were real symbolic or simply dew in a jar is still up for debate. Oddly enough, some women found ways to weaponize the virginity narrative. A few saints claimed divine protection of their virginity, like Saint Agnes, who said that any man who tried to touch her would be struck blind. Spoiler, according to legend, they were. These stories reinforce the idea that virginity was both sacred and powerful, and occasionally alarmingly vengeful. But here's the twist. While society elevated virginity, it also fetishized its loss. Literature is full of seduction stories, fallen women, and tragic heroines undone by their desires. Think of Chaucer's Miller's Tale, where a carpenter's wife is pursued kissed, and ultimately outwits all the men involved. It's bawdy clever and ends with someone getting branded in the behind with a hot poker. True story. Even in the legal realm, loopholes existed. Some church courts accepted a woman's word that she'd been seduced rather than a willing participant. In a few cases, this spared her from punishment. In others, it made things worse. Records show a widow in Florence fined for claiming she thought the man was an angel. Points for creativity. 0 for believability. For women entering nunneries, proving virginity could be essential. Some orders required a letter from a bishop or priest affirming their purity. Others accepted testimonials from family or midwives. In one case, a girl embroidered her own certificate onto her veil. Whether that held up in court is unclear, but it was undoubtedly fashionable. Ultimately, the medieval fixation on virginity was never really about anatomy. It was about power controlling bodies' bloodlines and behavior. It created pressure, fear, and more than a few elaborate lies. And yet under all that real people lived. Some clung to these ideals, others bent them. Many simply tried to survive the scrutiny with their dignity intact, and a good story for the next village feast. Because whether it was a trial by candlelight, a rooster in the courtroom, or a hymn sung with crossed fingers, medieval society may have judged, but it also quietly laughed. You're now leafing through the crinkled vellum pages of a very old, very serious-looking book. Its Latin script ornate its margins stained with candle wax and something sticky. No, this isn't a grim religious tome. It's a medical manual. And nestled between warnings about bad humors and suspicious moles, you find a chapter charmingly titled On the Proper Conduct of Marital Intercourse. Because yes, medieval people not only had sex, they wrote instructions for it. The kind of advice that begins with phrases like in accordance with divine proportion and ends with avoid too much joy for it weakens the knees. Many of these manuals were penned by clerics attempting to reconcile natural desires with theological expectations. One 13th century physician advised that couples should only lie together when both were sober, fully clothed facing north, and preferably silent. Missionary position was approved. Anything else was condemned as unnatural gymnastics. Try explaining that during pillow talk. Historians still argue whether these manuals were widely read or simply circulated among clergy and medical elites. But their contents are revealing not just in what they prohibit, but in what they fear. Passion, they warned, invited sin. Laughter during intimacy, a gateway to heresy. Pleasure, a dangerous temptation, unless it happened to lead directly to a child, and even then only begrudgingly acceptable. Yet some texts were more practical. The Trotula, that remarkable 12th century compendium of women's health, includes specific guidelines for when and how to initiate intercourse. One recommendation suggests couples abstain during full moons and feast days, but adds that after bathing and eating fennel, the mood may be improved. There you go. Medieval aphrodisiac, fennel, and soap. Another text, De Coitu by Constantine the African, gets surprisingly specific. It includes diagrams of the womb, mostly inaccurate lists of foods to increase desire, including eggs, almonds, and basil, and warnings about making love during thunderstorms. One particularly unlucky husband was struck by lightning mid-act and became a footnote in 3 separate medical manuscripts. Nature's way of saying not tonight. And what about frequency? Ah, yes, many manuals included helpful calendars. Some advised once per week, others said twice a month. One text from northern France suggested 3 times per season to balance the humors. Overindulgence, it was said, drained the body's vital essence and dulled the spirit. Which is medieval for you'll get sleepy and start forgetting prayers. These guides often emphasize timing too. The ideal moment for conception, according to several authors, was 2 hours before dawn in springtime, with both partners having eaten pomegranate seeds. Because nothing says romance like synchronized fruit consumption and sunrise scheduling. Beyond the technical advice, the moral tone loomed large. Sex was to be done without excess, without laughter, and with intent toward God. One English bishop even advised that husbands should not look their wives in the eye during intercourse, too distracting, too emotional, too risky. It might cause feelings. And yet not all advice was cold. Some writers acknowledged the value of mutual pleasure, albeit reluctantly. A few even admitted that a woman's enjoyment helped her conceive. This wasn't framed as a feminist breakthrough, but rather as biological necessity. Still, it created space, however narrow, for attention to the female experience. Quirky beliefs crept in, of course. Some manuals claimed that a child's temperament depended on the mood of the parents at conception. Angry sex produced combative children. Gentle, affectionate intercourse produced scholars and saints. One 14th century nobleman supposedly kept a journal ranking his mood before each conjugal visit. His 8th child became a monk. His 12th ran off with a minstrel. Correlation unclear. There were also warnings against dangerous lust. One treatise warns that too frequent coupling may cause blindness, leprosy, or melancholy. Another insists that inverted unions would result in children with crooked bones and wandering minds. Sound medical advice? No. But very motivating if you wanted to keep things strictly upright. Interestingly, not all texts condemned experimentation. Arabic medical literature translated into Latin and circulated in European courts included chapters on erotic pleasure, sensual massage, and even illustrated guides to positions. While these were often locked away in elite libraries, their influence trickled into courtly life. Some nobles sought out such books the way others sought relics, part curiosity, part status symbol, part bedtime inspiration. Monasteries, for their part, were scandalized. One abbot reportedly burned an entire crate of obscene medical tracts only to be caught later reading one behind a tapestry. A very human moment. Medical advice also extended to recovery. After intimacy, couples were advised to rest quietly, avoid cold drinks, and pray. One manual suggested eating figs and reciting Psalm 119. Another advised applying rose water to the temples. A few recommended gentle music, essentially a medieval Spotify chill-out playlist. For women, post-coital care often involved herbal infusions like elderflower thyme or verbena, believed to calm the body and restore modesty. And if conception was desired, the couple might sleep facing east to invite the blessing of celestial forces. If not, they might seek out a midwife the next morning armed with rue pennyroyal and more than a little discretion. Let's not forget hygiene. Bathing was considered important, though not always feasible. Public bathhouses doubled as social spaces and occasionally brothels, but married couples sometimes bathed together at home. The church discouraged this, of course, citing temptation, which was, let's be honest, kind of the point. Despite all the restrictions, manuals and advice books show a keen awareness of human nature. They scolded, yes, but they also understood that people would continue to be people. So they tried to guide, to contain, to spiritualize the bodily. Did it work? Sometimes. Other times it simply made things more complicated. But amid the incense and anxiety between the diagrams and the dire warnings, there was still something recognizably human, the hope that intimacy could be safe, sacred, and perhaps just a little sweet. And if not, there was always fennel. You're walking now beneath cloaked shadows and heavy silence. No manners, no barns, no altar candles. Just dim alleys, monastery libraries, and whispered verses passed from hand to hand. This is the quiet world of queer love in medieval Europe, a world largely unwritten, often erased and yet undeniably present, traced in margins, myths, and memory. Let's be honest, medieval society was not what we'd call inclusive. Church doctrine classified same-sex acts as sins against nature, often lumping them in the same category as eating meat on Fridays or sneezing too enthusiastically in the sanctuary. But people rarely fit neatly into the rules. They never have. So, while official records are scarce and hostile if you know where to look, poems court records, scandalous letters, you'll find flickers of same-sex intimacy glowing through the gaps. Take, for example, the monks. Ah, yes, those cloistered brothers, many of whom lived in all-male communities for decades, sharing dormitories, prayers, and moments that weren't always purely spiritual. Some monasteries were strict separate beds, no eye contact during matins, and confessions about impure thoughts every other Thursday. But others were more relaxed. Letters survived between monks that read suspiciously like love notes. One writes, "I crave the sound of your laughter more than I crave bread." Another, "You are my sunlight in this dark cell." If they'd had cell phones, they'd have sent emojis. Historians still argue whether these were expressions of brotherly affection or coded romance. Probably both. Medieval masculinity allowed for intense emotional bonds between men, what scholars now call homosocial intimacy. It wasn't necessarily physical, but it could be, and sometimes was. Court records from 14th century England include a trial in which two men were caught lying together in the barn, and no, they weren't counting sheep. The punishment was exile, but not before both men explained under oath that they had been lovers of the soul and the flesh. That phrase shows up again in Italian records where a pair of stonemasons were discovered living as brothers, yet shared only one bed, one blanket, and as one neighbor testified, sang to each other in the evenings like doves. And then there's the poetry. The Carmina Burana, a 13th century collection of secular songs, includes verses that flirt across gender lines. One poem describes a youth with lips of rose and eyes like stolen stars. Gender ambiguous, passion undeniable. Troubadours in southern France. Yes, the same guys who invented courtly love occasionally composed odes to male companions. And some female poets, like the elusive Comtesse de Dia, wrote verses that scholars suspect may have been directed toward other women. Though conveniently, the object of desire is often simply referred to as you. Queer women appear even less often in the historical record, but they were there. In convents and courtly households, in medical texts where female anatomy was described in surprisingly experimental terms. The Trotula again includes the passage about women who lie with women and experience sensual delight. The author disapproves naturally, but the clinical curiosity is telling. This wasn't mythology. It was observed behavior. One of the rare explicit cases involves two nuns in 15th century Germany whose relationship came to light when one of them confessed during Lent. Her letters preserved in ecclesiastical archives describe love as deep as the river and as warm as bread, and mention touches that sing like the Virgin's hymn. That's not subtle. When the church did take notice, punishments varied. Men accused of sodomy could face fines, public penance, or if things escalated, execution. But enforcement was inconsistent. Some towns ignored it. Others used it as a tool for political manipulation. In Florence, for instance, accusations of same-sex acts were sometimes used to discredit political enemies. Oddly enough, there were also loopholes. In certain legal systems, the act had to be witnessed to be prosecuted, which meant in practice that most cases only emerged when someone talked or was caught mid-act in a hayloft. One 14th century court record reads, "The said Thomas did cause the said Robert to blush and smile most indecently." Again, we have questions. Despite danger and stigma, queer relationships endured, and not always in hiding. In some medieval cities, there were known meeting places for men seeking male companionship. Paris had the infamous Rue des Lombards, where suspiciously well-groomed bachelors congregated. London had its own spots, often near the docks or the cathedral gardens. Some even had nicknames like the Orchard, the Red Bench, or the Bishop's Shadow. You get the idea. Theologians, of course, had thoughts. Thomas Aquinas labeled sodomy the gravest sin, while Peter Damian wrote an entire book decrying it as a threat to monastic purity. But not all clergy agreed. Some quietly argued that love between men could be sanctified if it remained without carnality, which may be the earliest recorded version of "we're just roommates." In the realm of saints and legends, things get more speculative. Saint Sergius and Saint Bacchus, Roman soldiers martyred for their Christian faith, were described in early texts as erotically united. Later translations scrubbed that phrasing, because nothing says uncomfortable like saints who cuddle. Art also hints at queer themes. Illuminated manuscripts occasionally depict two men embracing more intimately than was typical for brotherly love. In one manuscript, two women share a bed under a canopy with clasped hands and knowing smiles. The caption, "They comfort one another in piety." And then there's cross-dressing. Some women dressed as men to access male-dominated professions or travel freely. Occasionally, they entered male monasteries and lived undetected for years. One case tells of a brother John, who was discovered to be Sister Joan only after dying of a fever. The monks reportedly admired her piety and gave her full burial honors. No one asked too many questions. Queer identities didn't have the language we use today. There was no coming out, no community center, no pride parade. But the feelings, the bonds, the risks, they were real. People navigated them with humor, with care, and sometimes with incredible courage. So, as you pass through this medieval twilight, these quiet streets and convent gardens know that love took many forms. Some sanctioned, some forbidden. Some shouted in verse, some whispered through a crack in the chapel wall. And though the church may have tried to erase the margins, the heart, as always, found ways to write itself back in. You wander now through the back lanes of a bustling medieval city, not the noble courts or quiet cloisters, but the working quarters, the soldier camps and the shadowed alleys behind the bathhouses. This is the domain of courtesans, concubines, and the ever-moving world of women and men who work the night shift centuries before gas lamps were invented. Sex work in the medieval period was at once visible and taboo tolerated, and condemned managed and misrepresented. The church might preach morality and civic leaders might issue laws, but at the end of the day, or more often the end of the tavern shift, there was always someone willing to pay and someone willing to be paid. Let's start with the courtesans, not just sex workers, but women who often operated in the upper tiers of society. Especially in later medieval Italy and France, a courtesan could be educated, fluent in poetry, fashionably dressed, and sharper than any duke with a diploma. These women attended banquets, inspired ballads, and occasionally advised powerful men. One even received land in a tower in Venice from her lover because nothing says I adore you like real estate and high ceilings. Historians still argue whether courtesans were respected or simply tolerated with a gilded sneer. But in cities like Florence and Avignon, they carved out a curious niche between scandal and sophistication. Then there were the concubines. These relationships were semi-official, often long-term, and sometimes surprisingly domestic. A lord might keep a concubine if his marriage was political and his heart resided elsewhere. While technically outside the law, these arrangements were common. In fact, some noble households openly housed both wife and mistress under separate roofs, and with plenty of cold glances across the courtyard. One famous example, King Edward III of England's mistress Alice Perrers. She was given Jewel's land and enough influence to annoy Parliament into launching an investigation. She testified charmingly in rhyming couplets, medieval mic drop, but far more common were the everyday sex workers, women, and some men who labored not in palaces but in brothels, bathhouses, or on the street. In cities like London, Paris, Cologne, and Prague, prostitution was regulated by local authorities. That's right, regulated. Licenses were issued, fees were taxed, inspections were sometimes conducted. Medieval bureaucracy is always deeply invested in spreadsheets and shame. Many towns designated red light districts. In London, Southwark became infamous just across the river from the city proper, where civic laws grew fuzzy and people got frisky. Bathhouses doubled as brothels, their steamy interiors offering plausible deniability. The phrase stew house became a euphemism for all kinds of business. And what about the women? They came from everywhere. Orphans, widows, women abandoned by lovers or husbands, and those simply seeking survival. For some it was a temporary arrangement, for others a lifelong profession. They wore regulated clothing, often a striped hood or a particular color to signify their work. It was meant to shame, but it also created a strange kind of visibility and protection. One fringe tidbit: in certain German cities, licensed sex workers were invited to religious services provided they sat at the back and didn't make eye contact with the priest. In another region, a tax on prostitutes helped fund bridge repairs. If you walked across a river safely in 1397, you might have a brothel to thank. And yet, despite the regulations, life for these women was precarious. They were vulnerable to violent exploitation disease and sudden crackdowns whenever the church decided to clean up the streets. One bishop famously shut down every brothel in his diocese, only for the economy to collapse within a month. The brothels quietly reopened. Soldier camps had their own brand of sex work. Camp followers were women who traveled with armies, some providing laundry, cooking, and nursing, others more intimate services. Contrary to myth, many were wives or partners of the soldiers, but others moved from camp to camp, surviving through a blend of resilience, flirtation, and astonishing endurance. Quirky fact: one Swiss military document from the 1400s included a line item for blankets, beer, and women's wages. Medieval logistics everybody. Bathhouses also played a role. Public bathing was popular until the later Middle Ages, and bathhouses became social hubs, where lines between cleanliness and sensuality blurred like steam on a window. Mixed bathing was common, flirting was expected, and yes, extra services could be arranged. Some bathhouses had secret side doors, coded towels, and a bell system. One chronicler noted, "A man rings once for soap, twice for wine, thrice for delight." You can guess what happened after the third ring. And then there were the stories, some tragic, some outrageous. A woman in Bohemia posed as a nun by day and ran a brothel by night. Another in England was known as Mother Swain, respected for providing shelter to and company to passing clerics. Her house was eventually raided not for sex work but for selling expired pies. Despite their precarious status, some sex workers gained fame. Tullia d'Aragona, a 16th-century Italian courtesan and philosopher, published books on love and desire. Her writing challenged male scholars and earned her a place in intellectual circles. She was once accused of thinking above her station. She replied, "I think exactly at my height." There were also attempts at reform. Some cities established Magdalene houses for fallen women, part shelter, part prison. These institutions promised redemption, but often enforced silence, labor, and religious instruction with a heavy hand. Still, some women use them as a way to escape abusive pimps or start over. Men also sold sex, though they appear less frequently in records. Some catered to women, others to men. Their existence is hinted at in slang in court depositions and in city laws banning effeminate dancers from taverns. One Venetian ordinance warned against young men who sell their bodies as women do. The punishment? A fine and a public haircut. Apparently, the worst thing a medieval official could imagine was a bad barber. And yet, through all of this, the laws, the taxes, the sermons, sex workers endured. They built communities, looked out for each other, and navigated a world that alternately relied on them and pretended they didn't exist. So as you step out of the bathhouse or the brothel or the foggy corner of the soldier's camp, remember, medieval history isn't just kings and crusades. It's also the stories whispered behind doors, tucked into ledger books, and passed down in the worn-out shoes of women who knew how to survive. And maybe, just maybe, how to run a very efficient bell system. You're stepping now into a chapel, not a grand cathedral echoing with choirs, but a modest stone cell lit by a single candle. Here sits a woman in simple robes, eyes closed, lips slightly parted, not in prayer, but in what she calls divine ecstasy. Welcome to the realm of saints, sinners, and medieval erotic visionaries, where spiritual longing and bodily desire often collided in ways that would make even a modern therapist blink twice. Mysticism in the Middle Ages was full of passion. Some of the most famous saints, especially women, describe their experiences of God not just as emotional or intellectual, but as profoundly physical. They weren't just touched by grace, they were ravished by it. Take Saint Teresa of Avila, though technically more Renaissance than medieval, her legacy is rooted in medieval mystic tradition. In one famous vision, she described an angel piercing her heart with a golden spear, causing a divine pain, so intense it left her utterly consumed by the love of God. The sculpture by Bernini capturing this moment is, well, famous for a reason. It doesn't exactly whisper chastity. Earlier mystics said much the same, just with slightly more Latin and slightly fewer marble robes. Saint Catherine of Siena claimed a mystical marriage to Christ, complete with a heavenly wedding ring, which, depending on the version of the story, was either invisible or made from the foreskin of Jesus. That's right, you probably weren't prepared for that. Historians still argue whether these visions were expressions of genuine spiritual devotion or subconscious outlets for repressed physical desire. The medieval mind didn't make a sharp distinction between body and soul. To desire God with your whole being meant really your whole being, blushing cheeks, trembling limbs, racing pulse, and all. Not every vision was so abstract. Saint Lutgard of Aviers described a vision where Christ embraced her and pressed his lips to her heart. Saint Gertrude the Great, always the overachiever, received multiple visions of Christ, inviting her to rest her head on his chest and feel his divine heartbeat. Her writings are often tender, poetic, and just one metaphor away from a romance novel. Outside the cloister, theologians like Bernard of Clairvaux wrote commentaries on the Song of Songs, the steamy biblical book full of kisses breasts like twin fawns and fields of fragrant myrrh. Bernard interpreted all this as symbolic of the soul's yearning for Christ, but the imagery didn't exactly discourage more sensual readings. Meanwhile, sinners had their own kind of ecstasy. In penitential literature, people confessed to lust, temptation, and carnal acts in sometimes hilariously specific detail. One man confessed to overzealous thoughts during choir practice. Another admitted to kissing too ardently during a harvest feast. The punishments varied: prayer, fasting, or in one case wearing a sackcloth tunic with a cabbage leaf tied to his head to remind him of his passions. You have to wonder how effective that was. The Church, for its part, walked a fine line. It wanted saints who felt deeply but not too deeply. Female mystics were especially scrutinized. Were their visions true revelations or just unseemly outbursts of emotion? Many were grilled by bishops, examined by theologians, and asked to describe their experiences in exhausting detail, then judged based on how theologically sound their ecstasy appeared to be. One fringe tidbit: some mystics claim to feel physical pain, mirroring Christ's wounds, called stigmata. But a few also described sweet ache in the womb or holy trembling in their thighs. These descriptions were often censored in later copies of their writings. But some slip through, and modern scholars have had a field day trying to decode what was actually happening. And not all saints were celibate. Not technically. Some early church figures were married. Others, like St. Augustine, famously struggled with desire. "Lord, make me chaste," he prayed, but not yet. Augustine's writings read like an ancient self-help guide on guilt and the limits of self-control. You can almost see the parchment underlined in red. Art from the period also hints at the tension between sacred and sensual. In some manuscripts, the Virgin Mary is portrayed with unusually detailed breasts meant to symbolize nurturing, of course. But the artists weren't exactly subtle. Angels are depicted with androgynous beauty. Christ sometimes is illustrated with an almost bridal tenderness, receiving the soul like a groom welcoming his bride. And then there's the sinner-turned-saint archetype. Think of Mary Magdalene, traditionally, though not biblically, described as a former prostitute. Her transformation from fallen woman to devout follower made her one of the most beloved and most sensual saints in medieval Europe. Artists painted her weeping barefoot, clutching her hair and a skull. The imagery practically drips with drama and desire. In sermons, preachers used erotic metaphors to make a point. One friar described sin as a jealous lover who flatters then strikes. Another compared Christ's love to a flame that consumes every pleasure save its own. You can almost hear the medieval crowd murmuring, equal parts moved and mildly aroused. The tension between body and soul wasn't just spiritual, it was political. Female mystics who became too popular could threaten church authority. Some were silenced. Others were canonized, but only after their more colorful descriptions were edited for theological neatness. And yet through all this, visions, penance, sweaty ecstasy ran a current of profound sincerity. These women and men weren't pretending. They believed, they yearned. They poured their hearts into their writings and their bodies into their faith. So as you rest in this quiet chapel, listening to the rustle of a habit, the soft sigh of a prayer, you begin to understand. In the medieval, mind desire didn't always mean sin. Sometimes it meant closeness to the divine. Sometimes it meant madness. And sometimes it just meant being human in a world that wanted you to be something else. Whether saint or sinner, mystic or minstrel people in the Middle Ages still dreamed of being touched not just by hands but by grace, and sometimes both. You step now into the crowded, cobbled streets of a medieval city where buildings lean into each other like gossiping neighbors, and the scent of baking bread competes with horse droppings and last night's beer. Beneath the bustle behind the market stalls and under the candlelit eaves, you'll find the secret architecture of desire urban life, and the rendezvous it enables, encourages, and sometimes hastily conceals. If the countryside was open, raw, and public, the city was secretive, labyrinthine, and filled with possibility. For the young, the single, or the romantically restless, the city offered places to vanish. A tavern corner, a bathhouse stairwell, a rooftop after curfew. This wasn't love in the field beneath the moon, it was love next to the fishmonger between curfews, with one eye on the priest and the other on the night watchman. Let's begin with taverns, the social heart of medieval towns. These were more than watering holes, they were theaters of flirtation. A man might buy a woman a cup of spiced wine, a woman might drop her glove accidentally into his lap, and if both were feeling bold, they might disappear into the shadowy back room pretending to argue about debt. Love's oldest cover story. Many cities try to regulate such behavior. Curfews were enforced. Certain neighborhoods were designated for respectable women only. In Paris, city laws forbade wandering women from loitering near the bakeries after dark. The idea being, of course, that no one in their right mind went out at night just for bread. But the city made rules difficult to enforce. Its anonymity was both liberating and dangerous. You could be anyone. You could do anything. And in the maze of alleyways, desire often moved faster than the authorities. Historians still argue whether urban youth had more freedom than their rural peers. Certainly, city girls and boys had more excuses to mix apprenticeships, markets, festivals, church processions. One chronicler lamented that too much mingling near the cheese stall led to several bastard children and at least one broken ankle. The upper classes were no exception. Noble women in cities like Florence and Avignon often had more independence than their country cousins. They could attend church unchaperoned, visit public baths, and manage their own households, at least in theory. In practice, they also had secret lovers' messages delivered by servants, and a very good sense of how to keep the shutters closed when the guard passed by. And then there were the rooftops. In cities where space was scarce and buildings stood close, people used their rooftops as extensions of their homes. Meals were eaten there, laundry was hung there, and yes, lovers met there, crawling from one tiled slope to another like cats with better aim and worse intentions. Quirky fact: in 14th century Milan, a group of local monks complained to the bishop that immodest young men were leaping from roof to roof after sunset to visit girls. The bishop responded by fining anyone caught climbing a roof in tights. That's one way to ruin parkour. Bathhouses also provided space for intrigue. By the early Middle Ages, most cities had communal baths, segregated at first, but increasingly mixed in practice. People bathed, nude, chatted, drank, and occasionally disappeared behind steam curtains. While officially frowned upon, many cities tolerated this behavior, so long as taxes were paid and no one got too rowdy. One Viennese bathhouse had a menu of services: hot water, cold plunge beer, roast pork, and conversation. You can guess which item drew the most repeat customers. And then there were festivals. Urban life was dotted with feast days, saint celebrations, and carnivals. These were moments when the rules bent, when masks were worn, ale flowed freely, and social classes mixed. It was a perfect setup for brief, passionate, occasionally regrettable encounters. During Carnival in Venice, for instance, even nuns were known to disguise themselves and sneak into the crowds. One abbess later claimed she had only gone out to observe sin, not partake in it. Right, music too played its part. Minstrels performed in city squares singing ballads of love and longing. Some of their songs contained coded messages known as amorous riddles that allowed lovers to communicate across class and distance. A certain phrase, a particular melody, even the order of the verses could signal intent. One song ended with the line, "My door is unbarred, but only till the bells chime thrice." Poetic, risky, very much not approved by the parish council. Sometimes urban lovers arranged meetings in churches, usually in side chapels, during less attended masses. Confessionals, too, became spaces for whispered secrets. One friar in Avignon was reportedly disciplined for over-generous penances assigned to young women. Translation: he lingered a little too long behind the screen. Urban architecture also facilitated privacy. Multi-story homes meant stairwells and landings. Tapestries muffled sounds. Cellars offered cold, dark corners for more than just wine storage. And the noise of the city masked footsteps, gasps, and the occasional poorly timed sneeze. Let's not forget writing. In cities where literacy was growing, love letters became common. Some were elaborate, filled with puns and metaphor. Others were blunt. "I await you after the third bell. Bring wine." Scribes sometimes copied letters for clients without names, of course, unless paid extra to keep secrets. One fringe tidbit: certain chandlers' candle makers were rumored to double as couriers for lovers. The logic? No one questioned a candle delivery, especially in the dead of night. It's for the altar, they'd say. Sure it is. Despite the possibilities, urban love was fraught with danger. A discovered affair could mean public shaming fines or forced marriage. In some cities, a spurned lover could bring a case to court. One Parisian woman accused her suitor of making promises of eternal affection, then marrying a tanner's daughter with better teeth. The judge fined him 3 chickens and ordered him to recite a poem of apology. And yet people took the risk, again and again, because even in a world of laws, sermons, and watchmen, the city offered space, tiny flickering spaces for freedom. Behind shutters, under eaves, on rooftops, in shadows, and where there is space, there is longing. You're drifting now, into a dressing chamber lit by amber candlelight where laces are being tied, stockings smoothed, and someone is muttering furiously about whether crimson silk is too lustful for Wednesday. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws and seductive socks, where what you wore could not only get you noticed, but fined, gossiped about, or banned from communion. In the Middle Ages, clothes weren't just clothes. They were declarations of rank morality and sometimes very loud hints at what someone wanted to get up to after Vespers. And so governments and church officials, never ones to miss an opportunity to be offended, began passing laws about what people could and definitely could not wear. Sumptuary laws were everywhere. In England, a 1363 act declared that no one under the rank of knight could wear fur. In Florence, women were banned from wearing more than one jeweled belt at a time. In Spain, prostitutes were required to wear striped cloaks, presumably so they didn't accidentally seduce someone respectable. Spoiler, they still did. These laws were meant to reinforce the social order. Nobles wore velvet. Merchants wore wool. Servants wore rough linen. But the lines weren't always so clear. A butcher's daughter might inherit her aunt's embroidered kirtle. A merchant's wife might splurge on imported French lace. And suddenly the town reeve's nephew was confused about who was marriage material. Scandal. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws were about economic control, moral panic, or simple fashion policing. Likely all three. Records show that enforcement was spotty. One London court fined a tailor for creating a temptingly cut doublet. The tailor paid the fine, then made 5 more. Let's talk about codpieces. Ah, yes. The medieval male fashion statement, so unsubtle it practically had a zip code of its own. Originally designed to cover the gap between hose legs, practical modest, it quickly evolved into a peacock display of masculinity. Stuffed with wool, perfumed occasionally armored and sometimes absurdly large codpieces, became portable advertisements for virility. Some even had pouches for coins or keys. One particularly ambitious nobleman reportedly kept a small devotional book in his. His friends called it the Holy Pocket. We don't know if he was invited to many parties. Women, of course, had their own coded fashion. The neckline wars were real. In France, laws attempted to ban necklines that dipped more than 4 fingers' breadth below the collarbone. In practice, this led to a lot of very creative measuring and even more creative layering. Fashion has always outpaced the lawmakers. Stockings. Yes, sexy socks were also a statement. Bright colors, especially reds and greens, were associated with youth passion and occasionally irresponsibility. In England, unmarried women often wore bright hose on feast days. Married women tended toward darker shades unless they were trying to send a message. One chronicler wrote of a widow who wore scarlet hose to a funeral. She was married again within the month. And then there were shoes. Pointed shoes known as poulaines became so exaggerated that men could barely walk in them. Some cities banned them outright, calling them the devil's beak. One bishop declared they led the eye away from heaven and toward mischief. No further explanation was given, but we can guess. Accessories, too, carried coded meaning. A feathered cap tilted a certain way. A girdle tied in a double knot. Gloves perfumed with clove and rose oil. Even belt buckles, some carved with messages like, "Think of me or fortune is fickle." One court case from Bruges involved a woman accusing her suitor of deception because his belt bore the words, "Only yours," while he was in fact frequently borrowed. Jewelry had its complications. In Venice, married women could wear pearls. Unmarried women could wear coral. A mistake could spark gossip or worse. One Florentine father dragged his daughter from a market because she wore gold earrings, yelling, "You invite devils with your ears." She later claimed she thought they were brass. The court believed her, possibly because the earrings were hideous. Religious holidays came with special restrictions. During Lent, wearing bright clothing was frowned upon. In some towns banned, churches would scold vanity from the pulpit, and especially if someone showed up wearing red satin or anything deemed too worldly. One particularly popular preacher in Paris warned that those who adorn their bodies adorn their souls for fire. Harsh. Also possibly jealous of a very good hat. But fashion policing wasn't just about appearances, it was also about fear. The Black Death had reshaped society. Laborers had more money. Merchants were rising in status. Suddenly, lower classes could afford the same fabrics as their social betters. For elites, this was unsettling. For lawmakers, unacceptable. Hence, a flurry of laws trying to push everyone back into their designated wardrobes. Even prostitutes were policed. In addition to striped cloaks, some cities required them to wear bells or a distinctive sash. Others simply enforced designated zones. But many sex workers found ways to blend in, borrowing respectable clothing from friends, bribing tailors, or wearing their work shoes only after sunset. Fashion, after all, is portable camouflage, and in the church robes were symbolic. Monks wore brown, black, or white depending on their order. Nuns wore veils of varying lengths. But even here, subtle rebellions occurred. A nun in southern Germany was reprimanded for adding lace to her habit sleeves. She claimed it was a gift from the Virgin Mary. The bishop didn't buy it. One fringe tidbit: in 15th century England, a law was proposed to ban excessively decorative buttons. It failed because half the parliament showed up wearing them. Despite the laws, the people of the Middle Ages loved fashion. They loved color. They loved details. They loved hinting, flaunting, teasing, and expressing who they were, even if it meant walking too close to the edge of what was allowed. Because clothes in any age are more than just fabric. They're language. They say who we are, what we want, and whether or not we're free to say it. And in medieval times, sometimes all it took was a daring hemline and a perfectly pointed shoe to start a revolution. You're entering now a grand medieval cathedral, not as a pilgrim or sinner, but as a silent observer gazing up at saints carved in stone and frescoes of angels gazing down. But there above the altar is something different. A statue of the Virgin Mary, not meek, not bowed, but serene and radiant, her eyes gentle and knowing. Across from her in another chapel, a fading image of Venus, goddess of love, still clings to the wall of what was once a Roman temple. Here, in this uneasy silence between plaster and prayer, plays out one of the most enduring battles of the Middle Ages, the Virgin Mary versus Venus. Medieval people lived in a world of spiritual tension, and nowhere was that more apparent than in their relationship with love and desire. On one side stood Mary, the chaste mother, the model of purity, the spiritual ideal. On the other stood Venus, pagan goddess of love, beauty, sensuality, and all the other things preachers warned about after communion. This wasn't just a theological contrast. It was a cultural struggle playing out in sermons, poetry, art, and whispered tavern talk. Mary represented divine love, elevated, unattainable, safe. Venus, earthly love, messy, dangerous, and inconveniently human. Historians still argue how much classical influence truly survived into the medieval period. The Renaissance rediscovery of ancient texts is well known, but even during the so-called Dark Ages, Venus never entirely disappeared. Her name turned up in medical manuals and courtly poems, and even in the stars, astronomers still tracked the planet Venus, often associating her with fertility and troubled marriages. which, to be fair, is quite on brand. Venus was blamed for many things. A sudden elopement Venus, a woman who wore perfume to mass Venus, a knight caught writing suspicious poetry in the margins of his psalter, definitely Venus. Preachers railed against her influence, often equating her with the devil's temptress. But artists were not so quick to dismiss her. In manuscript illuminations and cathedral carvings, Venus sometimes peeks out disguised as Lady Nature or Frau Mien in German love allegories. She is the muse of troubadours and the whispered inspiration for sculptors, who somehow gave their Madonna's lips just a little too full and eyes just a little too soft. Meanwhile, the Virgin Mary was not just a theological figure, she was a cultural phenomenon. Shrines to her popped up everywhere. Songs dedicated to her multiplied in every language. Statues of her wept, moved, and glowed. She was the mother of Christ, but she also became the mother of cities, of knights of entire nations. And the closer she came to the hearts of the people, the more she absorbed every quality they longed for: gentleness, strength, grace, and yes, even beauty. Mary wasn't just above desire, she was the answer to it. For medieval men, devotion to Mary could act as a safe outlet for love otherwise forbidden. You could adore her without guilt. You could long for her presence in prayer. Some knights even took vows of chivalry not to kings but to the Virgin herself, calling her my lady and dedicating battles, poems, and the occasional heart-shaped pastry in her name. But Mary's image wasn't always demure. In some texts, she was portrayed as a powerful intercessor who could plead for sinners, scold the devil, and even negotiate the release of wayward souls. In one miracle tale, she yanks a lustful monk back from the gates of hell because he once sang to her while chopping wood. That's one effective fan club. Yet the tension remained. If Mary was perfect, how could real women compete? If Venus was sinful, what of the woman who simply wanted to dance without being judged? These questions lingered behind every sermon on modesty, every warning against temptation, every lecture about hair being the net of Satan. And the hair wars were real. Mary was usually depicted with covered hair signifying humility and virtue. Venus' flowing locks, often golden, always suggestive. In one poem, a woman is described as walking the line between Mary's veil and Venus's curls, which is poetic code for pretty but risky. One fringe tidbit: in some parts of medieval Europe, girls named Mary were discouraged from wearing red, too provocative for the namesake of purity. Meanwhile, red was absolutely Venus's color. In love manuals like The Art of Courtly Loving, red garments, especially garters or gloves, were considered signals of desire. A red glove left on a bench, a clear invitation. Unless, of course, it had simply fallen off. Context mattered. Astrology also kept Venus alive in the cultural imagination. People born under the planet Venus were said to be charming, pleasure-seeking, and emotionally intense. It wasn't uncommon for birth charts to be consulted before marriage, and more than one bride was warned to avoid men with too much Venus in their stars. Which honestly sounds like very good advice. But the most poignant part of this divine rivalry, they weren't entirely separate. Over time, traits of Venus seeped into Marian devotion and vice versa. Mary became not just a chaste figure, but a beautiful one. Tender, compassionate, radiant. And Venus, stripped of her overt paganism, became a symbol of longing poetry and the kind of love that couldn't always be controlled. Poets sometimes blurred the lines intentionally. In one Provençal song, the speaker praises My Lady of the Blue Veil and the Golden Smile. Is it Mary? Is it Venus? The ambiguity was the point. Desire and devotion lived in the same breath. Medieval people lived in that breath, in the pause between piety and passion, in the glance that lingered too long at a church fair, in the prayer that began Ave Maria and ended with an entirely different kind of yearning. So here you are standing, between two altars, one to the Mother of God, one to the Goddess of Love. And you realize that in this strange medieval balance, the sacred and the sensual weren't always at war. Sometimes they danced tentatively like two veiled figures in candlelight, circling each other beneath the vaulted ceiling of the human heart. And perhaps like the poet said, every soul longs both to rise and to burn. You're passing now through the bustling gates of a medieval city, where the guards yawn in the sun. Merchants shout their prices, and just behind the bakery with the suspiciously good-smelling pies, a painted sign creaks in the wind, the symbol of a brothel discreet and oddly cheerful. Welcome to the red light districts of the Middle Ages, where pleasure was regulated, taxed, and in more cities than you'd think licensed by the local government. That's right. Despite the church's thunderous disapproval, many medieval cities didn't outlaw sex work. They organized it. Brothels were often municipally sanctioned institutions, especially in larger cities like London, Paris, Avignon, Nuremberg, and Florence. Civic authorities didn't want to eliminate prostitution, they wanted to control it. For moral order, for public health, and let's be honest, for profit. Because when in doubt, medieval officials followed the money, and there was plenty of it under the sheets. Let's start with the laws. In London's Southwark district on the south bank of the Thames, technically outside the mayor's legal reach, licensed brothels flourished. The Bishop of Winchester controlled the area and collected rent from establishments known colloquially as stews. Hence the term Winchester geese for the women who worked there. The bishop collected tithes. The women collected coin. The city looked the other way. Brothel regulations were incredibly detailed. Some cities required weekly inspections by midwives or civic officials. Not for morality, mostly for signs of illness. Certain establishments had to close on Sundays and saints' feast days. Others were forbidden from operating near churches, schools, or bakers. Yes, bakers. No one wanted their honey tarts too close to other kinds of tarts. Prices, believe it or not, were sometimes fixed. In Avignon, the city issued a price list. One encounter with a licensed prostitute, 2 sous. Add wine, 3 sous. Special requests. See Madame for negotiation, no refunds. Historians still argue whether these systems protected women or merely exploited them more efficiently. On one hand, registered brothels offered some safety guards rules places to sleep. On the other hand, the women had little legal recourse if mistreated, and their earnings were often heavily taxed. In some cities, a portion of brothel profits funded public projects. One bridge in Toulouse was completed with the income of sin according to its proud inscription. And then there were the bans. Not marriage bans. These were public announcements read aloud in marketplaces or posted on city walls declaring that a woman had entered sex work often to avoid punishment for other crimes. The idea was to stigmatize the profession just enough to deter decent girls, but not so much that the city couldn't profit from it. The contradiction ran deep. On one hand, sex work was called a necessary evil, a safety valve to protect honest women. On the other, prostitutes were barred from guilds, buried in separate cemeteries, and refused sacraments unless they repented fully and permanently, something most couldn't afford to do. Let's not forget the taxes. Oh yes, there were brothel taxes usually collected monthly. Some cities levied flat fees, others took a percentage of earnings. In Barcelona, the brothel keeper paid the crown, the church, and the local merchant guild. That's 3 layers of bureaucracy before anyone even got undressed. And then there were the more creative levies. In Nuremberg, prostitutes paid a special tax during Lent if they wanted to keep working. In Florence, they paid for an annual inspection and were required to wear a yellow scarf or kerchief so no one confused them with virtuous women. Because nothing ruins a church festival like a mistaken identity situation at the fish stall. Still, despite the stigma, some sex workers carved out small realms of autonomy. Brothel madams often ran their establishments with authority and savvy. They managed staff, negotiated contracts, and even kept ledgers, some of which survive. One madam in Avignon ran her house like a legal firm, complete with a notary, a bouncer, and a rotating menu of services. Quirky fact: in parts of Bohemia, brothels were required to keep a bed ledger listing the names of clients, times of visits, and any disputes. Imagine the drama when 2 knights saw their names listed for the same hour. Outside the legal world, unlicensed sex work thrived too. Streetwalkers, bathhouse companions, and private mistresses often earned more and kept more than their registered counterparts. But they also risked arrest, expulsion, or worse. Some cities enforced curfews for free women and required them to carry permits. Others simply patrolled the alleys with sticks and sermons. Church authorities predictably disapproved, but even some clergy admitted it was better to contain vice than drive it underground. St. Thomas Aquinas famously argued that prostitution was like the sewer system, disgusting but necessary to keep the rest of society clean. A charming metaphor. Still, tensions flared. Reformers periodically tried to shut brothels down. One friar in Bruges incited a mob to burn 3 stews. The result: higher rent for the remaining ones and a quick sermon about the dangers of zealous overreach. Women who left the profession often entered convents, especially the so-called Magdalene houses that accepted fallen women. Some found redemption, others just found laundry duties and really bad soup. And what about love? That happened too. Some clients fell in love with prostitutes. A few married them. There are stories of knights who redeemed their beloved, buying her freedom and setting her up in a cottage outside town. One woman from Ghent left the brothel, opened a bakery, and became famous for her cherry tarts. She named her shop Le Deuxième Commencement, the second beginning. We like to think she was happy. Behind the ledgers and laws, behind the bands and the bells, the reality of medieval sex work was messy, human, and filled with contradictions. These were women and men who navigated a world that both relied on them and condemned them. They were part of the city even as they were pushed to its edges. So, as you stand at the threshold of a brothel door painted red, slightly crooked, always open, you understand. This was never just about sin or money. It was about survival control desire, and the strange way a society both uses and punishes the people who provide its most forbidden comforts. And sometimes those comforts came with a receipt. You're seated now in the back corner of a flickering hall, where a midwife whispers to a trembling girl, and the village priest tightens his jaw as the town scribe records yet another awkward confession. Welcome to the tangled, uncertain world of medieval pregnancy, paternity, and penance, where a single miscalculation could mean marriage shame or a heartfelt prayer that no one does the math. For medieval people, sex and conception were deeply linked, not just biologically, but theologically, legally, and socially. In a world without paternity tests and with more saints than doctors tracking the consequences of intimacy, involved a mixture of observation, guesswork, and more than a few times divine intervention. First, let's talk about conception. The going belief was that it required not just a man's seed in a woman's receptacle, but mutual pleasure. That's right, many medical texts claim that a woman needed to climax in order to conceive, which meant that if a woman got pregnant, it was assumed she had enjoyed herself. This led to some troubling implications in court cases, especially those involving coercion. A pregnant woman's testimony could be disbelieved because, well, clearly she consented. Look at the results. Yes, logic was not always medieval society's strong suit. Once pregnant, a woman's status changed overnight. For a wife, this could mean social security. For an unmarried woman, it often meant scandal. She might be fined, forced into marriage, or brought before the ecclesiastical court to name the father. If she refused, things could get creative. In one village, an unwed mother was placed in the town square and made to spin a wheel while the names of local men were called out. The one at whom she pointed when she stopped was declared the father. Historians still argue whether this was a ritual, a game, or simply mob justice dressed up as entertainment. Paternity disputes were common and serious. Inheritance, dowries, and honor all depended on legitimacy. If a man denied fathering a child, the woman had to prove otherwise. This could involve witness testimony. We saw them behind the barn, my lord midwives offering anatomical insights, or in rare cases, trial by ordeal. Yes, trial by ordeal. In one 13th century case, a woman claimed a nobleman had fathered her child. He denied it. The court ordered both parties to walk barefoot across hot plowshares. The one who emerged unburned was telling the truth. She emerged with blisters. He fainted. The case was dismissed. And what of miraculous births? Oh, there were plenty. Some women claimed their pregnancies were divine, either to cover shame or express sincere, if mistaken, belief. One nun, when found with child, claimed she had been visited by the archangel Gabriel in a dream. The abbess, unimpressed, summoned the bishop. His response: "Then let the angel raise the child." The baby was quietly sent to a rural monastery. There were also tales of virgin births among saints' peasants and the occasional overambitious storyteller. Medical texts tried to explain these, often concluding that spiritual fervor could stimulate the womb. Others pointed fingers at demon's wind or bathing too vigorously near men. Nature and theology made strange bedfellows. Midwives played a crucial role. They weren't just birth attendants, they were protectors, negotiators, and occasionally interrogators. Some were licensed by the church and required to swear they would report unwed mothers. Others kept secrets, forged records, and helped women pass off pregnancies as premature births after sudden weddings. One fringe tidbit: in parts of Italy, women used amulets with Latin inscriptions to shield unborn children from shame. These were worn on the belly under clothing and often buried with the placenta. The belief was that the charm could erase the stain of sin if the father remained unknown. It probably didn't work. But it says a great deal about the anxiety surrounding these pregnancies. For married couples, pregnancy could still be politically dangerous. A noble woman whose husband died while she was pregnant might be accused of infidelity, or worse, of attempting to pass off another man's child as a legitimate heir. This led to bizarre rituals of verification. In Scotland, a countess was once confined to a guarded room for the entire duration of her pregnancy, with witnesses present around the clock. When she gave birth, the child was immediately inspected by a panel of clergy and midwives. Their verdict legitimate. The mother probably exhausted. In France, it wasn't unheard of for families to issue birth announcements, sworn by the town priest and midwife to preempt rumors. These included the time of birth, the weather, and which saint's feast day it occurred on. One such record begins: "Born to the Lady Adele on the day of Saint Honoré at the 6th bell after sunrise, amidst rain and questions." And then came the penance. Whether married or not, conception outside the strictly prescribed conditions. No holy days, no feast days, no excessive joy. Remember, often meant a trip to confession. Priests asked detailed questions. Was it on a Friday? Were you standing? Did you laugh? All of these might increase your time in penance or in purgatory. One particularly unlucky baker confessed that he and his wife had conceived their third child during the hour of meat roasting on a fast day. He was sentenced to 3 weeks of fasting daily prayers and public recitation of the Psalms while abstaining from touching meat or his wife. But not all penance was harsh. Some confessors were gentle, acknowledging that people were human, and that love often ignored the church calendar. Others used the opportunity to deliver dramatic sermons about the dangers of satin bedsheets and overflavored stews. Blame the paprika, not the passion. In the end, medieval pregnancy was an uncertain, high-stakes affair. Joy, shame, survival, and status were all bound up in a growing belly and a community's curiosity. Fathers were guessed, mothers were judged, and babies were born into a world where identity mattered from the very first cry. Yet, even in the fear and confusion, life pressed forward. Babies arrived on feast days and market days in straw-filled corners and candlelit halls. Some were baptized with pomp, others with tears. But all were part of the great, messy, miraculous story of human desire and everything that followed after. And when the child smiled for the first time, even the priest softened. You wake now in the heart of a medieval town, the morning sun barely cresting the rooftops, casting long shadows down narrow alleys. There's a buzz in the air, not the clatter of carts or the chant of monks, but something juicier. Gossip. Scandal. And just beyond the pillory in the market square, a crowd gathers to hear it all because nothing gets medieval tongues wagging faster than a little bedroom drama. Court records, those dusty scrolls of scribes and officials, preserve far more than contracts and land disputes. They're also overflowing with tales of illicit trysts, love triangles gone sideways, and villagers loudly accusing one another of sins with colorful local flair. It's all their names' occupations, who was seen slipping through whose back door and at what hour. Because justice in the Middle Ages wasn't just about what you did, it was about who heard about it. In the ecclesiastical courts, yes, the church had its own legal system. Sins of the flesh were a constant theme. Unmarried couples caught lying together in suspicious proximity. Married folk accused of wandering affections, even one confused miller who insisted he was simply sleepwalking in her direction. The bishop's clerk did not believe him. One surviving record from 1372 details a case in which a woman, Johanna, accused her neighbor of winking with intent. The court ruled that winking alone did not constitute seduction, but warned him to stop or face penance with ashes. Another record, no less dramatic, involves a man who was seen kissing a widow under a fig tree on 4 separate Sabbaths. He was fined a pig. Historians still argue whether these cases reflected widespread enforcement or just selective spectacle. But in either case, they show a society deeply obsessed with public morality, especially when the public had nothing better to do than watch their neighbors get shamed for smooching near a bread oven. Enter the pillory. The medieval version of public shaming wasn't subtle. You'd be locked into a wooden frame head and hands exposed, planted firmly in the town square. Sometimes signs were hung around your neck. Adulterer, lewd woman, liar. If you were lucky, people just pointed and tittered. If not, they threw old vegetable stones or, in one memorable case, live frogs. One fringe tidbit in York. A man found guilty of inappropriate thoughts toward his cousin's wife was made to stand in the pillory wearing a tunic that read, "My eyes wander." He later claimed it was unfair because he had only imagined sin. The court's response, so did Lucifer. In addition to punishments, gossip itself served as a form of social control. Towns were small. Privacy was rare. A glance held too long a hand, resting too gently a giggle behind a hay cart, all of it became fodder for local rumors. Medieval people weren't shy about policing one another's behavior. In fact, there were official roles for it. In some communities, women were appointed as searchers, volunteers tasked with observing and reporting suspicious activity. They attended births to confirm the identity of fathers. They testified in fornication cases. One woman proudly noted that she had seen 3 bedsheets and 2 midwives in just 1 week. Promotions were not offered. There were also morality poems and folk songs that acted as both entertainment and warning. Ballads told of lusty monks who fell into wells, farmers whose wandering hearts led them to bad cider and worse decisions, and wives who gave birth to twins when their husbands were away too long. Subtle never, memorable always. And when cases reached the courts, defenses were creative. One man accused of seducing his neighbor's wife argued that he was compelled by a dream sent by Saint Valentine. Another, brought before the court for lying with a washerwoman, insisted it was a spiritual union intended to bring him closer to humility. The judge fined him 2 chickens and suggested cold water. But even in all this embarrassment, there was nuance. Not everyone was punished. Some couples managed to marry before their case was heard, which often nullified the offense. Others offered donations to the church, a few coins, a candle, sometimes a particularly nice goose. Forgiveness was available, especially if you came with poultry. Occasionally, the court sided with the woman. In one remarkable case, a young woman accused of promiscuity defended herself by producing a letter from her suitor, in which he referred to her as "my little dove, sacred in my eyes." The judge, bemused, ruled that the man had incited holy feelings in her heart and should therefore marry her or become a monk. He married her. She kept the letter. Court records even reveal moments of levity. A tavern brawl in Canterbury erupted after a man referred to another's mistress as a goose with no feathers. The insult was not about her beauty, but about a rumor that she had skipped her Lenten penance. The fight ended with someone thrown into a barrel and everyone fined for disturbing the peace. Gossip, of course, didn't always need evidence. Hearsay traveled fast. One widow in a French village was accused of sleeping with her shepherd simply because he smiled too often when delivering eggs. Another woman was rumored to have bewitched 5 husbands into early graves. She claimed they all had weak chests. The village nodded grimly and crossed themselves when she walked by. And then, of course, came poetry. Medieval satire delighted in mocking lovers. One poem described a man so infatuated that he confused his wife with a sheep. Another warned young women not to trust men who wear too many buttons. Their hearts are as loose as their laces, it declared. Button counts were apparently a known red flag. Even animals made their way into love scandals. In one bizarre case, a woman claimed that her goat had witnessed the sin and could testify through its behavior. The judge allowed the goat into court. It bleated. The case was dismissed for lack of coherent testimony. And so the medieval courtroom was not just a place of judgment, it was theater gossip mill and occasional stand-up comedy. The people came not just to see justice served, but to be reminded with a wink and a wince that human desire was messy, unpredictable, and always, always someone else's fault. Because in a world where the only privacy was what the walls could muffle and the church bells rang out every confession, your best hope was to sin quietly or at least make it worth the fine. You find yourself now at the edge of a quiet bedroom, its shutters half latched against the twilight where a gray-haired scribe sits beside a low fire quill, scratching slowly as a voice murmurs its final truths. This is the end of a long life, the closing chapter of desire, regret, and revelation. Welcome to the deathbed confessions, hidden diaries, and lingering legacies of medieval intimacy. In a time when every soul feared the afterlife more than taxes or toothaches dying, well meant confessing everything. And for many, that included the sins of the flesh, real imagined or curiously poetic. It was common practice to summon a priest to the bedside in the final hours. The sacrament of confession, known as last rites, offered the chance to clear the slate. And some people really cleared it. Father, one dying night, whispered, "There was a widow in Rouen, a merchant's wife in Calais, and something that happened in a vineyard, but I can't recall the saint's name." The priest, according to the record, sighed deeply and continued. Historians still argue whether these confessions were dramatic performances or heartfelt acts of redemption. Probably both. In many cases, they were the first and last chance to say what had been buried beneath years of silence, guilt, or discretion. Deathbed confessions sometimes changed lives. A woman might name the true father of her child. A man might acknowledge a secret lover. One merchant confessed with trembling hands that he had lived with his dearest friend Thomas, not as brothers, but in shared warmth. The priest, moved, offered absolution. The merchant died smiling. Others were more theatrical. One bishop, known for his firebrand sermons on virtue, whispered in his final breath that he had kept a love letter from a laundress beneath the altar cloth for 20 years. The letter was never found, but the next bishop had the altar thoroughly scrubbed. And then there were the diaries. Though most medieval people couldn't read or write, those who could occasionally left behind remarkable personal writings, fragments of longing, accounts of forbidden passion, or awkward reflections on romantic missteps. These were not polished memoirs, but scattered thoughts, sometimes scribbled in the margins of ledgers or prayer books. One scribe, whose notebook was found centuries later, had written a list titled, "Women I Thought I Loved in Order." It included 6 names, 2 question marks, and a final line that read, "I may not have known them, but they taught me to listen." Love tokens, too, were preserved long after desire had faded. Locks of hair tucked into missals. Rings buried with prayers. In one particularly odd case, a knight's will specified that a silk ribbon belonging to his beloved lady, unnamed, be folded and placed over his heart, so I may carry her beauty into the darkness. The priest objected. The squire did it anyway. Some left money or property in their wills to lovers or illegitimate children. One nobleman bequeathed a vineyard to the child of my springtime errors. Another left the blue cloak worn at our first meeting to a woman who curiously did not appear in any legal records. The cloak was found in her cottage, neatly folded, never worn. In towns and cities, the deaths of known lovers often sparked whispered tales. At one funeral in Bruges, a widow refused to walk behind her husband's coffin, declaring in front of the priest, "He left me cold in life, and I shall not follow him into death." The priest coughed. The choir sang louder. Even gravestones sometimes hinted at past affections. In a small churchyard near York, one inscription reads, "She was not mine by law, but mine by soul." Another, more playful, "We loved, we laughed, we lied to the priest. God understands." Let's not forget the stories passed down orally, those murmured over fires, told during spinning nights or harvest feast. Tales of secret weddings, of runaway brides of men who vanished into monasteries after one too many regrets. These were the bedtime stories of adulthood, half warning, half wistful, usually ending with, "So remember, child, never trust a man who wears too much perfume." And yet for every dramatic tale there were quiet truths. Couples who grew old together, not always happily, but with a kind of worn-in familiarity. Letters exchanged during war. Candles lit in memory of long-gone partners. Small, persistent rituals of love that outlasted youth and scandal. Some monasteries kept books of remembrance listing not just the names of donors, but also those for whom prayers are requested. Occasionally, a name would appear beside a scribbled heart. No explanation, just remembrance. The Church, of course, tried to frame all love within the context of divine order. Marriage, chastity, penance. But people being people never quite fit the framework. Their legacies wandered, they told different stories. One woman dying at 90 asked that her old spinning wheel be given to the daughter of the man I almost married. No one knew who she meant. The daughter cried anyway, and so as twilight closes around the bed and the last breath is drawn, we see that medieval love didn't end with youth or even with life. It lingered. In confessions and candles, in forgotten poems and well-worn ribbons, in the way someone looked toward the sky just before they went quiet. Because in a time when everything was recorded by hand and remembered by heart, even the most secret love had a way of leaving its trace. Sometimes on parchment, sometimes in song, sometimes carved quietly into stone. You lie still now as if beneath a vaulted ceiling where only candlelight dances. The flicker of one last scene unfolds not in bedchambers or confessionals, but in the quiet ways medieval intimacy echoed across centuries. Because even as the people of that world turned to dust, their sighs, secrets, and smiles never quite vanished. Let's walk through one final place, a medieval museum. Not the kind with velvet ropes and gift shops, but a curated memory space of the heart. Here are the tapestries where lovers' eyes almost meet just a thread's width apart. The pilgrim badges shaped like hearts worn under tunics and never mentioned aloud. The faded court records that, while meant to scold, still preserve the sweetness of a stolen kiss or an awkward love letter, sealed with beeswax and regret. Here tucked in the corner is a love token, a broken comb. Found in a well beside a ruined inn, it still carries a carved name, Alis. Was it given, stolen, tossed into water after a betrayal? We'll never know. But the object remains stubbornly delicate like a whisper from a time when love had fewer words but no less weight. And over there, don't miss it, is a simple woolen cap, too small for an adult labeled child unknown. Perhaps a child born of passion or mistake, wrapped in a blanket stitched with care. The stitching is uneven. The love behind it is not. Historians still argue what to make of medieval love. Was it repressed? Exploited, romanticized? Perhaps it was all of these because medieval people, for all their rituals and rules, were undeniably human. They loved foolishly, deeply, desperately. They made mistakes. They reached out for each other in a world filled with danger and prayer. They didn't always have the words, but they had gestures, a glance through a church screen, a flower dropped on a path, a whispered vow by candlelight. And when they had no one to speak to, they spoke to saints, or wrote to Mary, or sang to themselves in quiet kitchens, and still the songs survive. Somewhere in the archives of a monastery in Burgundy is a tiny parchment slip. A love poem unsigned, folded twice. It reads, "Though your hands will never hold mine, may they hold bread and light and peace. I loved you as far as God would let me." That might be the most medieval thing of all, loving within limits and dreaming beyond them. And perhaps now, as you rest your head, you can understand that the Middle Ages were not just a time of iron and ink, but of softness, longing, and infinite small courtesies that tried to make sense of desire in a world ruled by fear and faith. So let the world dim. Let the past quiet its breathing. And as this story fades to shadow, know that the loves of the medieval world were many imperfect, profound, unfinished, just like ours. And now, with your eyes growing heavier, let's let the world slip a little further away. The streets are empty now, the shutters drawn, the candles low. You drift past the quiet echoes of footsteps down corridors where old secrets sleep. Let the hum of ancient voices soften into silence. Let the weight of the day slip from your shoulders like a robe at the end of a journey. Nothing here asks anything of you now. No court, no confession, no judgment. Just quiet. You can still feel the warmth of the fire, hear the faint lull of a distant bell, tolling not for warning but for comfort. There's no need to hold on to the names, the dates, the rules. They've faded with the parchment and the stars above the cloisters. All that remains is the humanity, the touch, the ache, the hope. Rest in the knowing that even in the most devout, dangerous, and disciplined of times, people loved quietly, furtively, fiercely. I'll be here with another story for you tomorrow night.